Lego to all of you. In the future, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Anyone want to guess what he's talking about? Is he talking about his second coming? What's that?
Judgment Day.
Really? You missed it then.
Oh no.
Because it said, Jesus told you it's coming in this, before this generation, right? In this generation.
Resurrection.
Resurrection. This is all about the resurrection. This is not about the second coming of Christ. Because he told the high priest, what would they see?
Yeah, the Son of Man coming in the clouds.
Now, did we hear that before? When did we hear that before? That was in time statement. The time statement of the Telos, right? We're talking about the temple. Right? And he said, within this generation, he also told the high priest they would see it. So what are they going to see? The resurrection. The resurrection. What is Matthew pointing us to in the whole of all the dialogues? In the telic dialogue, in all the dialogues? The resurrection. The resurrection. We'll see that in any case. But then the high priest tore his clothes and Legoed. Before this, he was what? Echoing, right? Past tense. Now he makes a what kind of statement? An argument statement, a logos statement. Do you see what Matthew's doing? Do you see how we missed this? This is terrible because in English we miss this. This is so important to get. And yet, it said. Even when Jesus gave his, or the guy said he gave his opinion, it was said. It's not said. This is logos. He gave an argument. He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? What's the blasphemy? What was the blasphemy that he spoke?
He claimed to be the Son of God.
Well, no, he did not claim to be the Son of God. What did he claim to be?
Equal with God.
God! He claimed to be God. As a matter of fact, I'll backtrack just a second because I love this imagery. I wish I should have put it down, but I love this imagery, so I'll backtrack for just a second. Back in the narrative between the Sermon on the Mount and the second dialogue, one of the most beautiful scenes there is when Jesus says that I am the what groom? The bridegroom. Who is the bridegroom? Who is the bride? No, it isn't. Who is the bride? All right, guys. Old Testament. Think about the Old Testament Apocrypha. Who is the bride in the whole of the Old Testament Hebraic thinking?
Jewish.
Israel. Israel's the bride. And who is the bridegroom?
God.
God! No, not the Messiah. God. No messianic content in the Old Testament really at all. Except there's a little bit, but very little. The bridegroom is always God, and the bride is always Israel. Right? And the bridegroom is going to trade. God is going to claim Israel. What does Jesus call himself in that narrative? I am the bridegroom. He just called himself what? God. He said, I am God. And by the way, the rest of the narrative proves that, which is really cool. It's a really neat part of the narrative. So in any case, then what does he do? Does anyone remember? I love this scene. It's so cool. What's the next thing that happens after he declares himself? Well, first he says, I am the bridegroom, and then he says, what, you don't patch new clothing with old patches, right? Mm-hmm. What's the new clothing he's talking about? Okay? When you are a bride or a bridegroom, what do you always wear?
New clothing.
New clothing. Okay? This stuff all fit. You know, you've got to read, you can't read Matthew like they're pithy sayings that some guy said. They're not. They're cohesive constructions that relate one to the other. So therefore, when Jesus says he's a bridegroom, he just called himself God. Then he says new clothing. He's talking about what? The new clothing worn by the bride and the bridegroom. Then he talks about new wine. He's talking about what? What's the first miracle of Christ?
Wine in Cana.
Wine in Cana at a wedding, right? He's talking about the wine for the Wedding feast. And then the next one, what happens? What's the next thing that happens? So beautiful. He's approached from behind in the marketplace by a woman with blood that has a bloody discharge. They could not be with their husband because of that. Now you know what this is, right? She is a bride who, because of uncleanliness, could not be a bride. Did you get this? She's a bride who could not be a bride because her husband cannot touch her sexually under Jewish law, right? But what does she do? She says, surely if I touch the fringe of his cloak, I will be made, not healed, I will be made sozo. I will be saved. That's what he says literally in the Greek. I will be saved, sozo. He touched her and heals her, and Jesus said, your faith made you not healed, saved. No, not whole, saved, sozo. Therefore, Jesus allowed the untouchable bride to touch him. Why? He's the perfect bridegroom. He's God. Then the next one, what happens next? What happens right after that? The guy comes and says, my daughter has died. My daughter is dying. Come help, right? And they go, and there's flute players. Flute players means it is a Greek funeral. No Hebrews do flute players, okay? So he goes in to Jarvis's daughter, to his daughter, right? The girl, okay, what kind of bride is she?
Not yet.
She's a girl that can't be a bride because it says literally in the Greek, she's a girl basically that's unable to be taken because she's not old enough yet. So she can't be a bride because she's too young. But she's also dead. So she'll never be a bride because she's dead. So she's too young and so Jesus made her alive again. What does that represent?
Her wedding.
He is the perfect bridegroom, and what did he just accept? Her. Do you see this? And by the way, both of them are what? Women. Women. What does this represent? It represents specifically to Matthew the fact that Jesus Christ called himself God as the bridegroom. And not only that, he came for who? For all of them. For women, even those who could not be brides because they were unclean, those who could not be brides because they're... And what are women considered in this culture? Worthless property. And yet Jesus they were so important to him that he did what? He made them his bride. Not literally, of course, figuratively, and it's kind of a Hebraic concept. But that comes to the point. What's the blasphemy? The blasphemy is that he called himself God. He didn't make himself equal with God. He said, I am God, which, by the way, is the Trinitarian message that was promoted by the church, right? In the creeds, the Nicene Creed, right? They're separate but equal beings, right? The Arian heresy was that they were separate. See, that's the big fight between the Nicenes and the Arians. So, in any case, the big point is that that's why the high priest legoed. He has spoken blasphemy because he called himself God. And they knew this. Guy been walking around. Look, I don't care what Dan Brown says. Dan Brown's kind of an idiot. Because this guy Jesus in Matthew, at least what we've seen and what I could show you, called himself God multiple times, over and over again. All 5 of these arguments depend on one singular assumption being true. So let's look at it. We have a thesis statement. Why the Messiah? We have a setting statement, assumption. The kingdom of heaven is near. We have a participant statement. Who is in the kingdom of heaven? A value statement. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And a time statement. The coming of the kingdom of heaven. All right. Can anybody tell me what this looks like? What this, well, not just what it looks like, but what it is. This is the outline of every logical argument that's ever made. When you make a logical argument. You guys, anybody study logic when they were in school? Come on, guys, you never did a logic course? If you do a course in logic, when you set up a logical argument, What do you start with? Okay, even beyond that. Anybody write a dissertation? Anybody not want to write a dissertation, right? When you write a dissertation, what do you start with?
Why you're right.
A thesis statement. Then what do you state? Your assumptions and definitions. And guess what we have here? We have an assumption, the kingdom of heaven is near. Then we have definitions. Definitions. Who is in the kingdom of heaven? Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? When is this going to happen? What do we have here? We have a logical argument set up in what we would call a dissertation formation, dissertation form. This is a dissertation form logical argument. This is classic. This is a way we've put these together since the beginning of logical thought. You know this in Matthew? This is Matthew. All of these are true only if Jesus is Christ the Messiah. And so therefore, what is the proof of his being God or divinity or of all these statements? The physical resurrection. And that's the point. The point is the physical resurrection. That's the point of Matthew. And therefore, we could almost, is the resurrection itself a telos? No. What is the telos of Matthew? The fact that the resurrection proves what? Well, proves what? Specifically proves what? Proves his thesis, right? You see this? It proves his thesis. When you write a thesis, what do you use the whole rest of the document to do? Prove it. Prove it. So therefore, he's told you a thesis, he gave you assumptions, he gave you definitions, and therefore the end point does what? Proves it all. And that's the point. Matthew, well, and here's the end point. Then Jesus came to him and said, all authority in heaven and earth was given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Because one, in his resurrection, they saw him what? Coming on clouds of glory at the right hand of God the Father. That's the point. So, conclusion. Matthew's five-part argument. Thesis, assumptions, participants, values, and time. It's proven by the resurrection of Christ. That's the point of Matthew. You just thought Matthew was a
Tax collector.
tax collector with a bunch of sayings, right? And, you know, just be very simple about this. All ancient Greek literature is written this complexly. All ancient Greek literature is written like this. We want to Englishize it, anglicize it, and make it what? Simple. It's just sayings, right? This guy was just a dumb itinerant preacher wandering around, right? And Matthew was just a dumb tax collector, right? However he did it, Matthew produced an incredibly powerful thesis document. And the telos is the point that's proven by the resurrection. So, in any case, thanks for your attention. Next time we'll talk about Mark and Matthew together.
Oh,